Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My father once told me I was the spine of the family. 7 years later, he told a judge I was a thief. Both statements were made with the same voice, steady, certain. The voice of a man who has never once considered the possibility that he might be wrong. Gerald Price doesn't wonder. Gerald Price declares. And for 23 years, I believed every declaration, because when your father speaks like the weather report, you don't question whether it's raining. You just grab an umbrella. The umbrella, in my case, was a calculator, then a spreadsheet, then a full accounting system I built from scratch at 16 because my mother was too sick to do the books, and my father couldn't tell the difference between revenue and profit. He still can't. That's not an insult, it's a line item. I ran his business for 7 years. 4 laundromats across East Atlanta, 31 employees at peak, annual revenue crossing $900,000 by the time I left. He paid me a total of $189,000 across all 7 years. When I did the math, and I always do the math, that works out to roughly $27,000 a year, $13 an hour if you count the overtime, which nobody did, because family doesn't punch a clock. Family doesn't punch a clock. But family does, apparently, file lawsuits. But you need context. Numbers without context are just decoration. So let me go back 7 years and approximately $423,000 back to the beginning. Gerald Price opened his first laundromat on Covington Highway in 2006. I was 10. The place smelled like chlorine and overheated polyester, and the industrial washers shook the concrete floor hard enough to rattle the gumball machine by the entrance. 14 gumballs fell out the first week. I picked them up and put them back. Nobody asked me to. I just didn't like things being out of place. That should have been a warning sign. My father was a big man with a bigger voice. He could fill a room just by clearing his throat. In our neighborhood, Avondale Estates, the kind of Atlanta suburb where people waved from their lawns but kept their fences high, Gerald Price was a story people liked to tell. Started with nothing. Built something. Never borrowed $1 he couldn't pay back by Friday. The Rotary Club loved him. The Baptist Church loved him more. My mother, Bonnie, was the opposite frequency. Quiet, thin-smiled. She handled the books before her body decided otherwise, and she handled my father by agreeing with him before he finished his sentences. It was efficient, if you didn't think about it too hard. I tried not to. Then there was Amber, my younger sister by 3 years, and the living proof that you don't need to be competent to be adored. That sounds cruel. I don't mean it cruelly. Amber was bright the way a sparkler is bright, immediate, attention-catching, and gone in 45 seconds. She was the daughter Gerald showed off at church. I was the daughter Gerald brought to the laundromat. The divide happened early. Amber got dance lessons, piano lessons, a bedroom painted lavender because she saw it in a magazine. I got the room with the desk, the filing cabinet my father dragged home from an office liquidation sale, and a Texas Instruments TI-84 calculator with a silver case. "Here," Gerald said, tossing it on my bed like it was a pack of gum. "You like numbers so much, knock yourself out." I was 12. The calculator was heavier than I expected. Cold in my hands, the buttons stiff and precise, each one clicking like a tiny promise. I didn't know it then, but that calculator was the first salary my father ever paid me. It was also the most honest one. I wore through the silver paint on the number 7 within a year. Carried it in my backpack to school, to the laundromat, to the kitchen table where I did homework while Amber watched television in the other room. Numbers made sense to me in a way that people didn't. Numbers stayed where you put them. Numbers didn't change the rules halfway through the conversation. Numbers didn't look right through you while telling your sister she was special. The year I turned 14, I won first place at the regional science fair. Statistical analysis of water usage patterns in commercial laundry facilities. I'd collected 9 months of data from my father's machine's gallons per cycle, variance by load weight, cost per gallon optimization. The judges said it was the most thorough data set they'd seen from a high school student. One of them asked if I'd had help from a parent. I said no. She looked at me for a long moment and wrote something on her clipboard. I brought the trophy home on a Tuesday evening. Small thing, fake marble base. Gold-colored figure holding a beaker. I set it on the kitchen counter next to the mail. Gerald glanced at it. "What's that?" "Science fair. First place. Regional." He picked it up, turned it over once, put it down. Must have been a slow year. Then Amber came through the back door, backpack swinging, ponytail bouncing, already talking before she was fully inside. Dad, I made cheerleading! JV squad! And Gerald Price, the man who spoke like a weather report, who never raised his voice for joy the way he raised it for everything else, Gerald Price smiled. That's my girl. The trophy went into a shoebox under my bed. I didn't throw it away. Throwing it away would have meant it mattered enough to hurt. I just put it somewhere I wouldn't have to count it among the things I owned. The calculator stayed in my backpack. That I kept. Because the calculator didn't care who held it. It just did the math. And the math, unlike my father, never lied. 6 years later, when my mother's lupus made the books impossible and Gerald needed someone who could tell revenue from profit, he didn't call an accountant. He called the daughter with the calculator. Just until your mom gets better, he said. It was the longest just until of my life. The lupus came for my mother in the spring of 2012. She was 47. I was 16. Amber was 13 and had just discovered eyeliner, which she applied with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her a favorable review. Bonnie's hands went first swollen, stiff, the knuckles angry and red. She couldn't grip a pen for more than 10 minutes without her fingers locking. She'd been doing the books for Price Family Cleaners by hand since 2006. Ledger paper, green columns, ballpoint pen, every number in her small, precise handwriting. 6 years of figures, filed in manila folders in the filing cabinet that used to be in my bedroom. Kendall. Gerald didn't sit down when he said it. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, the way he stood when he was about to issue a weather report. Your mother can't do the books anymore. You're the smartest one in this family with numbers. Just until she gets better. I said okay. Not because I wanted to. Because saying no to Gerald Price was like arguing with gravity, technically possible, but you'd lose. That first week, I spent 41 hours at the laundromat outside of school. I know because I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. My mother's old ledger was a mess of crossed-out numbers and sticky notes, and within 3 days I'd moved the entire system into Excel. Revenue by machine, expenses by category, payroll by employee, tax liability by quarter. Gerald looked at the spreadsheet I printed and taped to the wall behind the register. He didn't understand half the columns, but the bottom number was green instead of red for the first time in 8 months, and that was a language he spoke. He put his hand on my shoulder. Squeezed once, the way you'd test whether a piece of fruit was ripe, and said, "You're the spine of this family, kid?" I held that sentence the way other girls held love letters. Folded it up, put it somewhere deep, took it out on nights when I stayed at the laundromat until closing because the quarterly taxes were due and Gerald was home watching the Braves. The spine of this family. 5 words. The most my father had ever given me that wasn't a calculator. The pay started at $400 a month. Cash, in an envelope Gerald left on the kitchen counter every first of the month. No pay stub, no tax withholding, no record except the one I kept myself. I bought a notebook, black cover, college ruled, 96 pages. I wrote the date and the amount on the first line. The 1st of March, 2012, $400. Cash. Then, underneath, in smaller writing, I listed the hours I'd worked that month. 167. That came out to $2.39 an hour, but I didn't write that number down. Some math you do in your head and leave there. The notebook became a habit. Every month, first line, date, amount. Every month, second line, hours. The ratio got slightly better over time, not because Gerald paid more, but because I got faster. By year 2, I could close the monthly books in half the time. Gerald didn't notice. He noticed the new dryer he could afford. He noticed the health inspector giving them a clean score for the first time in 3 years. He noticed Amber's homecoming dress, which cost more than my monthly pay. When I asked about a raise in my 3rd year, I did it the way I did everything with data. I printed a comparison. Average bookkeeper salary in the Atlanta metro area. Industry benchmarks for small business financial management, hours logged. I left it on the kitchen table next to Gerald's coffee. Bonnie found it first. She sat down across from me at breakfast, slid the paper back, and smiled the way she smiled when she wanted something to disappear quietly. Honey, family doesn't keep score. I opened my mouth, closed it, wrote in the notebook that night. Year 3. Still $400 month. Requested raise. Denied. Reason. Family. The number 400 became a kind of weather constant, predictable, neither warm nor cold. I stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about the temperature of the water you're swimming in. It was just the medium I lived in. Gerald's business grew. I grew it. The correlation was perfect, and the compensation was irrelevant, because family doesn't keep score, and I was the spine, and spines don't invoice. Amber, meanwhile, was finding herself. That was Gerald's phrase, finding herself. And he used it the way people use umbrella terms to cover things they don't want to examine too closely. Amber went to Georgia State on Gerald's dime, changed her major 3 times: communications, hospitality, business management. Joined a sorority. Gerald paid the dues without asking what they were for. Your sister is finding herself, he told me one evening when I was reconciling payroll and Amber was posting photos from a mixer. She's a free spirit. I found myself at 16, I thought, in a laundromat, with a calculator, but I didn't say that. I said, "Sure, Dad." There was a woman at the original Covington Highway location named Doris Caldwell, 62 at the time, presser for 11 years, the kind of woman who arrived 20 minutes early every morning to make a pot of coffee so strong it could probably file its own tax return. Doris didn't talk much. When she did, it landed. She'd watched me come in after school, still in my uniform, and work until the machines shut off at 10. She'd watched me eat dinner from the vending machine, Doritos and a Sprite, $2.75 combined, which I logged as a business expense and then crossed out because it wasn't. She'd watched me celebrate my 18th birthday by finishing the year-end reconciliation 2 days early. One evening in November, a Tuesday I remember, because the dryers on the south wall were running a 13-minute cycle instead of 12, and I was trying to figure out why Doris set a cup of coffee on my desk. She waited until I looked up. "Child," she said, "you were never the spine of that family. You were the whole skeleton." And they never figured out the difference between a person and a structure. I didn't understand her. Not then. A spine holds things up. A skeleton holds things up. What was the difference? The difference, I'd learned 7 years later in a courtroom in Florida, is that a spine is part of a living body. A skeleton is what's left when everything alive has been stripped away. But at 18, sitting under fluorescent lights with a spreadsheet open and Doris's coffee going cold, I just wrote the hours in my notebook and went back to the numbers. The numbers always made sense. The numbers never asked me to be grateful for being used. Have you ever added up the hours you gave to someone who never once asked what they owed you? By the time I was 20, Price Family Cleaners had 2 locations. By 22, 4. I found every lease, negotiated every contract, set up the POS systems, hired and trained the managers, built the inventory tracking spreadsheet that Gerald still printed out every Monday morning and pretended to read. Revenue the year I started? $320,000. Revenue the year I turned 22? $918,000. I remember the exact number because I stared at it on my laptop screen for a long time the night I closed the year-end books. $918,000 flowing through a business my father started with a single location and a stack of quarters. 4 locations now. 31 employees. A second commercial dryer contract. A pickup and delivery service for 3 apartment complexes that I'd pitched, sold, and implemented while Gerald was at a Rotary dinner. Gerald bought a new truck. Ford F-150, metallic blue, leather interior. He drove it to church on Sunday and told everyone business was good. "Built this from nothing," he said, leaning against the hood like it was a trophy. My raise came that year, $400 to $500 a month. Gerald handed me the envelope on the kitchen counter the same way he always did without eye contact, like feeding a parking meter. "Here," he said, "giving you a raise. See? I take care of my family. $500 a month, $6,000 a year, for managing a $900,000 operation." I wrote it in the notebook. Didn't write what I was thinking, because the notebook was for numbers, not for the sound a person makes inside when they realize the raise they received is less than the monthly payment on their father's new truck. Doris noticed. Doris always noticed. She caught me in the back room one afternoon, counting rolls of quarters for the change machines. "Your daddy drives a new truck," she said. "You drive the same Civic since high school." "I don't need a truck," That's not the point, child. It wasn't the point. But I'd gotten very good at missing the point when the point involved confronting Gerald Price. So I counted the quarters, 14 rolls. $350, exactly enough to cover one of Amber's sorority formal dresses, and went back to the books. Meanwhile, Gerald was becoming a local legend. The Atlanta Small Business Alliance invited him to speak at their annual dinner. He stood at the podium in the metallic blue truck voice and said, "I built this from one machine in a dream." The audience clapped. I was in the back row, because someone had to reconcile the catering invoice, and I clapped too, out of habit. Out of the muscle memory of being a daughter who hadn't yet learned the difference between loyalty and erasure. Amber called that week. She needed $1,200 for a spring break trip to Panama City. Gerald wrote the check without asking Amber a single question. The same month, I requested a budget for new accounting software, $450, one-time purchase, and Gerald said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 7 months. I bought it myself. The books. That's where it happened. It was March of 2019. I was 22, finishing the tax return for the fiscal year, and I found a hole. Not a mistake, a hole. The kind that only appears when you compare cash register receipts to bank deposits and notice that roughly $43,000 passed through the machines and never arrived at the bank. I checked twice. 3 times. Pulled every daily deposit slip for 12 months. The pattern was clean. Almost elegant. Every Friday, the cash deposits from the Covington Highway and Memorial Drive locations were short by $800 to $1,000. Consistent. Deliberate. Invisible to anyone who wasn't cross-referencing 3 different systems. I'd been cross-referencing 3 different systems since I was 16. Gerald was skimming. Not a lot by his standards, maybe $40,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on cash flow, pocketing the surplus before it hit the books. And because I'd been the one filing the returns, my signature was on every form that said these numbers were accurate. My name. My social security number. My professional liability if the IRS decided to pull the thread. I confronted him on a Wednesday evening. The Covington Highway location, back office, door closed. I'd printed the discrepancy report, 6 pages, color-coded, highlighted. I set it on the desk between us. "Dad, this is tax fraud." Gerald looked at the pages the way he looked at things that inconvenienced him briefly, with irritation, the way you glance at a parking ticket before shoving it in the glove compartment. "It's cash management. It's unreported income. If the IRS audits us, we both go to jail. Not just you. Me too. My signature is on the returns. Your signature is on my business." He stood up. Gerald always stood up when he wanted the conversation to be over. He was 6 to 1. I was 5 to 5. The math was supposed to end the argument. "This is my business. My money. I built this. You do the books. That's it. Don't tell me how to run what I built. I won't sign this year's return." The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. "Then don't." He said it quietly. Not the way he usually said things. Not the weather report voice. Not the Rotary Club voice. Something flatter. The voice of a man who had just done a different kind of math and arrived at a different kind of number. 3 weeks later, Amber graduated from Georgia State with a degree in business management and a GPA that cleared the minimum by exactly 0.2 of a point. 3 days after that, Gerald found me at the Memorial Drive location doing end-of-month inventory. He didn't say "you're fired." Gerald Price didn't use words that could be quoted back to him. He said, "You're not needed anymore. Amber's graduating. She'll handle things from here." Amber, who had never balanced a checkbook, who thought accounts receivable was a type of email folder, who once asked me what net meant, and, when I explained, said, "So it's like the real number?" "Yes, Amber, the real number." I didn't argue. I didn't point out that Amber couldn't read a profit and loss statement. I didn't remind him that I'd grown his revenue by $598,000 in 7 years. I didn't do any of the things a person with less practice at being quiet would have done. I opened the notebook, turned to the last page, wrote one number, $189,000. Total compensation, 7 years, 3 months, 14 days. Then I closed the notebook, put it in my bag, picked up the calculator, the TI-84 with the worn-out 7, still heavy, still precise, and put that in my bag too. Okay, I said. Gerald blinked. He'd prepared for a fight. He had the volume ready, the posture ready, the lines ready. But I gave him nothing to push against. And a man who communicates through force doesn't know what to do when the opposing force simply steps aside. I walked out the way I'd walked in 7 years earlier, quietly, carrying a calculator. The only difference was that now I knew exactly what I was worth. And it was more than anyone in that building had ever been willing to pay. The door closed behind me. The bell above it rang once. I didn't count the ring. Some numbers you let go. The garage apartment cost $800 a month. First and last plus deposit $2,400. I counted it out from the envelope I'd been keeping in the glove compartment of the Civic, which still smelled like dryer sheets and industrial detergent because everything I owned smelled like laundromat. My hands smelled like laundromat. My hair, my one good interview blazer. 7 years of chlorine and hot polyester had seeped into the fibers of everything I touched, including apparently my saving strategy cash in an envelope in a glove compartment, in a car that had 211,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that came on every third Tuesday like a menstrual cycle. The apartment was in Lawrenceville, Georgia, 43 minutes northeast of the Covington Highway laundromat if traffic cooperated, which in Atlanta it never did. The landlords were Mr. and Mrs. Huang, mid-70s. Retired, quiet in the way that only people who have lived long enough to stop explaining themselves can be. Mrs. Huang brought me a plate of dumplings the first evening and didn't ask why a 23-year-old woman was moving into a garage apartment with 2 suitcases, a laptop, and a calculator. She just set the plate on the counter and said, "Microwave 30 seconds if they get cold." Then she left. I ate the dumplings sitting on a mattress on the floor. The mattress was new, $189 from the clearance section at a furniture outlet on Buford Highway. I noticed the price and then wished I hadn't, because $189 was exactly 1,000th of what I'd earned in 7 years, and the math on that was the kind of math that turns a mattress into a metaphor whether you want it to or not. The ceiling had cracks. I counted them that first night because counting was what I did when the alternative was thinking. 17 cracks, radiating from the light fixture in the center like a frozen starburst. I lay on the mattress and traced them with my eyes and told myself that 17 cracks in a ceiling was not a sign. It was not a symbol. It was a building code issue, and someone should probably mention it to the Wongs, but not tonight. Gerald cut the phone that week. I'd been on the family plan since I was 15, one of those invisible threads that keeps a daughter tethered, even after the tether stops making sense. The service ended on a Thursday. I know because I was trying to check my email for interview confirmations, and the screen just said "no service" in small capital letters, like a tiny bureaucratic rejection. I drove to a T-Mobile store and bought a prepaid phone for $47. New number. No contacts. I sat in the parking lot and typed in exactly 2 numbers from memory. Doris Caldwell and the Okaloosa County Tax Assessor's Office, because I'd been researching property tax structures for a work project that no longer existed, but old habits are harder to kill than old phone plans. Bonnie texted 3 days later, from a number I didn't recognize. She must have gotten the new one from Doris, or from the Huang's landline, or from the supernatural network that mothers operate on, regardless of carrier. The message said, "Come home. Dad didn't mean it. We can work this out." I read it 11 times. Not because the meaning was unclear, because I was trying to find the part where she said, "You were right about the taxes," or "We should have paid you more," or even just, "I'm sorry." 11 readings. 0 apologies. 100% on brand for Bonnie Price. I didn't reply. Deleted the message. Then undeleted it because some things you keep not for comfort but for evidence. Filed it in a folder I named Family. It was the first and, for a long time, the only item in that folder. The job search lasted 23 days. I applied to 47 positions: accounting assistant, bookkeeper, office manager, anything that wanted someone who could read a spreadsheet without blinking. I got 3 callbacks, 2 interviews, 1 offer. Junior Environmental Compliance Officer, Greenline Energy Solutions, Norcross, Georgia, $52,000 a year, benefits, a 401k with a 3% match, and a pay stub, a real pay stub, printed on perforated paper with my name at the top and the deductions itemized below like a poem I'd never been allowed to read. I'd like to tell you I accepted the offer, with dignity and composure. That the ice water thing people would later see in a courtroom was always there, fully formed, a personality trait rather than a scar. But I sat in the Civic in the parking lot of Greenline Energy Solutions on a Tuesday afternoon in August, with the offer letter on the passenger seat and the air conditioning wheezing its last useful BTUs, and I cried. Not delicately, not cinematically, the kind of crying that comes from a place below the lungs, somewhere behind the ribs where you keep the things you promised yourself you'd never feel. My shoulders came forward. My hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The offer letter slid off the seat onto the floor mat, and I let it fall because my body was too busy doing 7 years of math all at once. $52,000. For me. On the books. With taxes withheld, and a benefits package, and a direct deposit into an account with exactly one name on it. Not family, not the business, not an envelope on a counter left without eye contact. A number with my name attached to it, and a company that would give me that number because they valued what I could do, not because I was someone's spine or skeleton or unpaid infrastructure. The crying lasted 9 minutes. I timed it afterward, not because I wanted to, but because the clock on the dashboard was the first thing I saw when I lifted my head. 2:17 to 2:26. 9 minutes. I wiped my face with the napkins from the Chick-fil-A bag in the center console, blew my nose, smoothed the offer letter back onto the seat, and drove to the T-Mobile store to call Doris. "Child," she said when I told her. 52,000? 52,000. With benefits? With benefits. A pause. Then quietly, "That's almost twice what he was paying you. And they don't even know you yet." I hadn't done that math. But Doris had. And hearing it from someone else made it real in a way that my own calculator never could. The compliance work fit like a key in a lock I didn't know existed. Environmental regulations, permit audits, contamination reports, it was the same muscle I'd built at Price Cleaners. Read the rules, find the gaps, document everything, make sure the numbers match. The difference was that now the rules existed to protect something: water tables, soil quality, breathable air, instead of protecting Gerald Price's cash flow. And at the end of every 2 weeks, a direct deposit arrived in my account. The same amount, on time, without a speech about gratitude or a reminder that I lived under someone's roof. 6 months after starting, Amber called. I was eating lunch at my desk, a turkey sandwich and an apple. $4.30 from the deli downstairs, which I no longer tracked in a notebook because that particular compulsion was starting to fade. "Kendall, I need your help with the books. Dad says I should call you. I charge $85 an hour for consulting." The silence on Amber's end lasted longer than any silence Amber had ever produced. Then a click. Then nothing. A week later, Bonnie texted, "Amber is struggling. You could at least help your sister." I typed back, "I helped for 7 years. My invoice is in the notebook." Gerald sent nothing. Not a call, not a text, not a voicemail. I counted the days of silence the way I used to count dryer cycles automatically, without thinking about why. Day 50, day 100, day 187. Somewhere past 200, I stopped. Not because the silence hurt less, because I'd started counting other things instead: savings balance, quarterly performance reviews, square footage in apartment listings I bookmarked on my phone during lunch breaks. The lie was still there. I could feel it some nights, lying on the mattress that cost 1,000th of my 7-year salary, staring at the 17 cracks. If your own father doesn't see your worth, maybe there isn't any. But the lie was quieter now, quieter than the direct deposit notification. Quieter than Doris saying they don't even know you yet. Quieter than the calculator sitting in a shoebox on the closet shelf, still there, still heavy, still precise, but no longer the only thing I owned that told me I was real. I'm going to skip the montage. You know how it goes: the early mornings, the late nights, the slow accumulation of competence that nobody photographs but everyone eventually benefits from. I'll give you the numbers instead, because that's how I understand progress. And because the numbers are more honest than any inspirational speech I could stitch together. Year 1 at Greenline. 52,000. Junior compliance officer, Learned the EPA reporting framework in 3 months. My supervisor said I had an unusual comfort with documentation. I didn't tell her it was because I'd spent 7 years documenting a laundromat empire. Some resume items are better left vague. Year 2, 62,000. Promoted to mid-level. Handled the Savannah River site audit, a contamination assessment that required cross-referencing 14 years of soil samples. I finished it 2 weeks ahead of deadline. My supervisor stopped calling my documentation skills unusual and started calling them invaluable. The word landed differently than spine. It landed like something I could keep. Year 3, 68,000. Led my first independent project, coastal compliance review for a resort development near Jekyll Island. That project taught me something unexpected. I understood coastal property, not just the regulations, but the economics. Flood zones, erosion buffers, insurance liability, the invisible math that determines whether a beachfront lot is an investment or a money pit. I'd learned property valuation by accident, the same way I'd learned tax law by accident, because Gerald Price needed someone to do the work. And I was the daughter with the calculator. Year 4, 72,000. Senior Environmental Compliance Officer. But the real number wasn't on my pay stub. It was in a separate account I'd opened at a credit union in Decatur, the investment account. I'd bought a duplex, a small, ugly 2-unit property on a dead-end street in Decatur, Georgia. 1,200 square feet per unit, built in 1974. Roof that sagged in the middle like a tired horse. Purchase price, $142,000. I knew the comps, the inspection risks, the rehab costs, because I'd been running those exact calculations for Price Cleaner's commercial leases since I was 19. The skills Gerald built for his business, I repurposed for mine. I hired a contractor, managed the renovation budget on a spreadsheet that would have made my 16-year-old self weep with pride. New roof, new HVAC, updated electrical, cosmetic refresh. Total rehab cost, $61,000. Sold the duplex 11 months later for $283,000. Profit after closing costs, $78,412. I did it again the following year. A different property, a different neighborhood, a similar spreadsheet. Profit, $64,000. By the end of year 6, my liquid savings sat at $340,000. Not generational wealth, not lottery money, just the compound result of a woman who knew how to read a balance sheet, applying that knowledge to her own life for the first time. Every dollar was traceable. Every deposit was documented. Every transaction existed on the books, under my name, in accounts that Gerald Price had never touched and would never touch. And then I found the villa. It was an accident, or at least it started as one. A work trip to Destin, Florida, inspecting coastal construction permits for a hotel chain. The inspection site was on Henderson Beach Road, and on the drive back to my rental car, I passed a for sale sign on a property that made me slow the Civic to a crawl. 3 bedrooms, 2 stories, a wraparound deck that faced the Gulf of Mexico like an open hand. White clapboard siding, hurricane shutters, a palmetto garden that someone had loved and then abandoned. 200 feet from the water. The listing price was $2.1 million. I pulled over, sat in the car, did the math. Down payment at 16%, $336,000. I had $340 liquid. Mortgage on the remainder at 6.75%, approximately $10,800 per month. My salary plus rental income from a property I still held in Atlanta could cover it if I budgeted precisely, and budgeting precisely was the only thing I'd ever done. It was impractical. It was the most expensive decision I'd ever contemplated. And it was the first financial calculation I'd ever run where the answer at the bottom wasn't someone else's revenue or someone else's tax liability or someone else's profit. The answer was mine. I made an offer that afternoon. Closed 41 days later. 47 pages of documents, each one requiring a signature. I signed every page with the same pen, a Pilot G2, blue ink, the kind they keep in cups at bank counters. My hand didn't shake. I'd signed more stressful documents at 16. The villa was mine. The word tasted different when it applied to a building instead of an envelope of cash on a kitchen counter. Mine. $340,000 of down payment, every cent earned in the 6 years since a man told me I was not needed anymore. The closing agent handed me the keys, 2 of them, brass, on a plain metal ring and said, Congratulations, Miss Price. Nobody in the room shared my last name. Nobody in the room had ever called me spine or skeleton or not needed. They just called me the buyer. And the buyer had excellent credit. That first night, I sat on the deck. No furniture yet, just the deck boards and the railing, and the dark gulf stretching out like a second sky. The waves didn't crash. They folded. Over and over, the same patient motion, arriving and leaving without keeping score. I'd brought a box of things from the Lawrenceville apartment. In it, under a tangle of charging cables and old tax folders, I found the notebook, black cover. College ruled, 96 pages, 63 of them filled. I opened it to the last entry, the one I'd written in the back office of the Memorial Drive laundromat on the day Gerald fired me. 18,900美元. The number looked different out here. Smaller. Not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. The number was the same. I was not. I sat with the notebook open on my knees and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding since the day I signed the lease on the garage apartment. Not how much am I worth, I had spreadsheets for that. Not did I make the right choice, the Gulf was answering that one in real time. The question was simpler and harder. Am I happy? Not successful. Not stable. Not surviving. Happy. I didn't know. Happiness wasn't a line item I'd ever tracked. It didn't have a column in any spreadsheet I'd built. But sitting on the deck of a house I'd bought with money I'd earned doing work I was good at, holding a notebook full of numbers that no longer defined me, I knew something smaller and maybe more important. I was no longer calculating my worth in someone else's currency. And if that wasn't happiness, it was at least the neighborhood. I closed the notebook, set it on the deck beside me. Let the sound of the water fill the space where the numbers used to be. If you'd bought that house, the one you earned with your own hands, your own numbers would you have told your family? Or would you have kept it? Quiet and whole, like the only secret that was truly yours. I kept it, not out of spite, out of habit. The Price family had taught me one useful thing: keep the valuable things off the books. They just didn't expect me to apply that lesson to myself. Doris called on a Sunday in October. I was on the deck in Destin, reading a coastal erosion report for work, and drinking coffee that I'd made in my own kitchen in my own house, which was a sentence I still enjoyed constructing even 2 years after closing. "Child," Doris said, "it's bad." Doris had worked at Price Family Cleaners for 19 years. She'd survived 3 managers, 2 floods, 1 electrical fire, and Gerald Price's temper. When Doris said bad, she meant the kind of bad that doesn't wash out. Amber had lasted 18 months. In that time, she'd mixed personal expenses with business accounts, hair appointments, a lease on a Lexus NX, a vacation to Cabo that she'd coded as a vendor relations trip. She'd missed 2 quarterly tax payments because she didn't know they were quarterly. She'd let the workers' comp insurance lapse for 4 months, which was both illegal and, according to Doris, the kind of stupid that takes real commitment. The IRS noticed. They tend to, when $43,000 a year in cash stops appearing on the books, altogether not skimmed like Gerald used to do, but simply unrecorded, because Amber didn't understand the difference between revenue that passes through a register and revenue that exists. The audit hit in the spring of 2024. Penalty plus back taxes, $340,000. 3 locations closed within 6 months. The Covington Highway original survived barely running on a skeleton crew. Revenue dropped to $110,000. Gerald, who had spent 30 years filling rooms with his voice, apparently stopped filling them with anything. Doris said he came to the laundromat every morning, stood behind the counter, and stared at the machines like a man watching his own funeral procession tumble dry. "He doesn't yell anymore," Doris said, "just stands there." I listened, wrote down the number 340 penalty, 110 revenue, 1 location remaining in the margin of the erosion report. Old habit. Then I said, "Is Doris okay? Are you getting paid?" "I'm fine. Down to 20 hours a week, but I'm fine." "Good." A pause. Then Doris carefully, "He asks about you sometimes. Not by name. He'll say, 'The books used to be better.' That's how he says your name now." The books. I didn't respond to that. Some translations you understand, but choose not to acknowledge. Gerald Price had turned his daughter into a function, and now that the function was gone, he missed the function, not the daughter. the books. The villa stayed off the radar until February of 2025. I'd been careful, no social media posts, no housewarming party, no forwarding address filed with the family, but a college friend tagged me in a photo at Henderson Beach. Just a sunset shot, both of us holding drinks on the deck, the villa's white clapboard siding visible behind us. I didn't even notice the tag until 3 days later. Amber noticed sooner. Amber, who hadn't called me in 2 years, who hadn't asked how I was doing, or where I was living, or whether I was alive, suddenly developed the investigative skills of a forensic accountant, which was ironic, given her track record with actual accounting. She found the tag, screenshotted the background, Googled the address from the house number barely visible on the mailbox, found the county property records, found the purchase price, $2.1 million, registered to Kendall A. Price. Amber called Bonnie. Bonnie told Gerald, and Gerald, who had not spoken to me in nearly 6 years, who had replaced me with a daughter who cost him $340,000 in IRS penalties, who had once told me I was the spine of the family, and then told me I was not needed, Gerald called a lawyer. Not me. A lawyer. The complaint arrived on a Thursday. I was at my desk at Green Line, reviewing permit applications, when my personal phone rang with a Destin area code. Miss Price? My name is Wallace Taggart. I'm a property attorney here in Okaloosa County. I'm calling because you've been served in a civil action. Wallace Taggart Wally, as he introduced himself approximately 90 seconds later, had a voice like black coffee, no sweetener, no filler, but warm enough that you didn't mind the bitterness. He'd been practicing property law in the Florida Panhandle for 23 years and had, by his own description, seen every flavor of family lawsuit the Gulf Coast has to offer. Your parents are claiming unjust enrichment, he said. They allege you used family business funds to acquire your property at 1,847 Gulf Shore Drive. They're requesting the deed be transferred. To whom? Doesn't specify directly. But the filing references your sister's name in 3 separate paragraphs. I closed the permit application on my screen, opened a blank document, typed the case number Wally read me. Below it, I started counting. The word stolen appeared 6 times in the filing. Rightfully belongs 4 times. Family 23 times. Thank you 0 times. Sorry 0 times. Have you ever taken money from your father's business? Wally asked. No. Can you prove it? I can prove something better. The silence on Wally's end was the silence of a man doing math he hadn't expected. Then, I'm listening. They're suing me for $2.1 million. How much do you charge? $3.50 an hour. But for a case this interesting, I'll cap the retainer at $8,000. Interesting? Miss Price, in 23 years, I've never had a client who responded to a lawsuit by saying, I can prove something better. That's either confidence or insanity, and either way, I'd like to be in the room when it happens. The next 6 weeks were preparation. I drove to Destin 3 times, met Wally in his office, a converted bungalow, 2 blocks from the harbor, that smelled like old paper and salt air. We built the case the way I'd built every financial system I'd ever touched. Methodically, document by document, number by number. My personal bank statements, 2012 through 2026. Every deposit traceable, every dollar sourced. The price cleaner's payroll records, which I'd kept copies of, because I was the one who created the filing system, and I had backed up everything to a personal drive before Gerald changed the passwords. Total compensation to Kendall Price over 7 years, $189,000. And the centerpiece, a 1-page comparison document. Left column, what I was paid. Right column, the market rate for the services I provided. The gap between the 2 columns was $423,000. Wally read the document 3 times, set it down, picked up his coffee, took a sip that lasted longer than necessary. You're sure you want the judge to see this? He said. Because once he does, your father can never unsee it either. I thought about Gerald standing behind the counter of the last laundromat, staring at machines he could no longer afford to fix. I thought about the vest with 6 buttons. I thought about the calculator in the shoebox that I'd moved from the garage apartment to the villa's top shelf, where it sat like a retired employee still present, no longer working. He's spent 30 years not seeing me, I said. This is just the first time it'll be on the record. Wally sealed the document in a manila envelope, standard legal size, one page inside. He wrote the case number on the front in blue ink and set it on the corner of his desk, the way you set down something that might detonate. The hearing was in 19 days. I drove back to Atlanta, went to work, closed 2 permit reviews, and slept 7 hours. The envelope stayed on Wally's desk, in an office that smelled like old paper and salt air, waiting for a Tuesday in March. The Okaloosa County Courthouse in Crestview, Florida, is a low building with high ceilings, the kind of architecture that tries to make you feel small while pretending to make you feel important. I counted the steps from the parking lot to the courtroom door. 31. Same as the number of employees Price Family Cleaners had at peak. I wore a navy blazer, gray slacks, flats. No jewelry, no statement. The outfit of a woman who was not there to perform. Wally met me in the hallway in a suit that looked like it had attended more trials than most lawyers. He handed me a coffee black, no sugar, and said, "You ready?" "I've been ready for 7 years." "Good. Don't talk unless the judge asks you directly. Let the document do the work." "That's what I do, Wally. I let documents do the work." The courtroom was small. No jury civil bench trial. Property dispute. Judge Ellen Hargrove sat behind the bench, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, the face of someone who had heard every lie human beings were capable of telling and had developed a specific expression for each category. Gerald sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, Mitchell Greer, mid-40s, aggressive handshake type, the kind of attorney who says "Your Honor" the way a car salesman says "Great question." Bonnie sat in the first row behind Gerald, clutching a tissue she hadn't used yet but was keeping ready like a prop. Amber was 2 seats down, wearing a dress that cost more than Kendall's monthly grocery budget, which was $214. Not that I was counting, I was always counting. Gerald looked at me. First time in nearly 7 years. I looked back, counted the buttons on his vest 6. Navy fabric, slightly tight across the middle now. The same vest he'd worn to the grand opening of the Covington Highway location in 2006. I knew because I'd written it down. Opening day. Dad wore the navy vest. 23 customers. That notebook entry was 18 years old. The vest still fit him, mostly. The family didn't. Greer opened strong. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed Judge Hargrove with the confidence of a man who had prepared his argument and not his client's actual financial records. "Your Honor, the defendant, Kendall Price, served as bookkeeper for the plaintiff's family business for approximately 7 years. During that time, she had unfettered access to all financial accounts, all banking credentials, and all revenue streams. She leveraged this intimate knowledge to acquire a $2.1 million beachfront property in Destin, an acquisition far beyond the reasonable means of her current reported income." He paused, looked at me. I didn't look back. I was counting his word choices. The plaintiffs contend that Miss Price siphoned funds from the family business over the course of her employment, constituting unjust enrichment. We respectfully request that the court order the immediate transfer of the property deed. Stolen appeared 4 times in his opening. Family appeared 9 times. Siphoned twice. Respectfully once, which was generous. Gerald nodded after each accusation, the way a man nods when the pastor reads the scripture he picked for the sermon. Approving. Certain. The weather report face. Judge Hargrove turned to our table. "Mr. Taggart, your response." Wally stood. He did not button his jacket. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Your Honor, rather than a lengthy rebuttal, we'd like to submit a single exhibit." He reached into his briefcase and set the manila envelope on the table. Then he looked at me and gave a small nod, not rehearsed, just permission. I reached into my bag and took out the calculator. The TI-84. Silver paint almost entirely gone now, just gray plastic and worn buttons. The number 7 a smooth blank, where my thumb had rubbed it into oblivion over 18 years. I set it on the table next to the envelope. Didn't explain it. Wally didn't reference it. It just sat there, old and heavy and precise. Like a witness that couldn't speak, but didn't need to. Gerald saw it. I watched his eyes track from the envelope to the calculator and stop. His mouth opened. Closed. His hand moved toward the table and then pulled back, as if the calculator was something that might burn him. He recognized it. Of course he did. He'd bought it for a 12-year-old girl who liked numbers, and now it was sitting in a courtroom where that girl was not defending herself because she didn't need to. Wally slid the envelope to the clerk. The clerk passed it to Judge Hargrove. She opened it, unfolded the single page, and read. The courtroom was already quiet. But the silence that followed was a different species of quiet, the kind that has texture, that presses against the walls. Judge Hargrove read the document twice, removed her reading glasses, put them back on, read it a third time. Then she looked at Gerald. Mr. Price, Gerald straightened. Yes, Your Honor. Your daughter worked as your full-time financial manager for 7 years. Is that correct? She helped out. It was a family arrangement. According to this document, her total compensation over 7 years was $189,000. The judge let the number sit in the room like a stain on a white tablecloth. Is that accurate? Gerald shifted. She lived at home. Room and board. Mr. Price, the estimated market value of the financial services your daughter provided, bookkeeping, tax preparation, payroll management, business expansion oversight, is $612,000. Another pause. Your daughter was underpaid by approximately $423,000 over 7 years. Greer looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Greer. Neither had known. The lawsuit was built on the assumption that Kendall had stolen. Nobody had checked what Kendall was owed. Greer's face did something lawyers' faces aren't supposed to do in front of a judge. It said, very clearly, you didn't tell me about this. Gerald's face said nothing. For the first time in his life, Gerald Price had no weather report to deliver. Judge Hargrove continued, not only is there no evidence of misappropriation, Mr. Price, this court could reasonably conclude that it was your daughter who was deprived of fair compensation. She looked at the document again. And this was the compensation for what you described in your deposition, as she found the line, the spine of this family? The words hung in the room. Gerald's words, spoken in a laundromat kitchen 15 years ago, quoted back to him under fluorescent courtroom lights by a judge who had no reason to be gentle about it. Gerald opened his mouth. Greer put a hand on Gerald's forearm. Pressed once. Gerald stopped, closed his mouth, sat back. For the first time in 63 years, someone told Gerald Price to be quiet, and Gerald Price listened. Case dismissed. No grounds for unjust enrichment. Property solely and legally belonged to Kendall A. Price. Judge Hargrove noted for the record that the defendant could pursue a counterclaim for unpaid wages, should she choose to. Wally leaned toward me. Do you want to file? I looked at Gerald. He was staring at the table, both hands flat on the surface. Not shaking still. The kind of still that isn't calm. The kind that happens to buildings right before the foundation gives. No. You sure? 423,000 is not a small number. Some debts aren't worth collecting. I looked at the calculator on the table, gray plastic, worn 18 years of someone else's math. The number is on the record. That's enough. I picked up the calculator, put it in my bag, stood, walked out of the courtroom without looking back at the plaintiff's table, where my father sat in a vest with 6 buttons, learning for the first time what his daughter's silence was worth. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled like floor wax and vending machine coffee. Wally walked beside me, briefcase in one hand, the other tucked into his pocket. He didn't rush. Lawyers who've been doing this for 23 years don't rush. They walk at the speed of paperwork. You did good in there, he said. I didn't do anything. I submitted a document. Exactly. We were almost to the glass doors when I heard her. Not her voice, her shoes. Bonnie Price wore low heels that clicked on hard floors with a rhythm I'd been hearing since I was old enough to recognize the sound of someone approaching who wanted something. Click, click, click. Faster than usual. Kendall. I stopped. Didn't turn around. My hand was on the push bar of the door. The metal was cold. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4 the way I count when the alternative is reacting. Kendall, please. I turned. Bonnie stood 6 feet away, tissue still in her hand. Mascara intact, she hadn't actually cried, just held the tissue like a casting director told her to. Her eyes were red at the edges, though. That part might have been real. With Bonnie, the math on what was real and what was performance never quite balanced. Are you? She stopped, swallowed, started again. Are you happy? The question landed in the hallway, like a coin dropped in a church. Small, bright, impossible to ignore. Family doesn't keep score. That was Bonnie's line. She'd said it when I asked for a raise at 19. She'd texted it when I asked why they were suing me. She'd built an entire philosophy around the idea that love and accounting occupied separate rooms, and anyone who tried to open the door between them was the problem. But accountants do keep score. That's the whole point of the profession. And the score was always there in the notebook, in the pay stubs, in the 7 years of deposits that never matched the work. The only difference now was that a judge had read it out loud in a room with a court reporter. I looked at Bonnie. She was 61 years old. Her hands were still swollen, the lupus hadn't gone anywhere, even if her ability to use it as leverage had. She looked smaller than I remembered, but that might have been the hallway, or the overhead lighting, or the fact that I was no longer 16 and willing to believe that smallness meant fragility instead of strategy. "That's the first question you've asked me in 7 years," I said. "That didn't start with, 'Can you help?' I didn't answer whether I was happy. Not because I was being cruel, because the answer was complicated, and Bonnie had never been good with complicated. She was good with simple stories, simple roles, simple explanations for why one daughter got everything and the other got an envelope on the counter. Complicated would have required a conversation we weren't going to have in a courthouse hallway, and probably weren't going to have anywhere. I pushed through the door. The Florida sun hit my face. March. 74 degrees. I counted the temperature automatically. The way I counted everything, not because I needed to, but because the numbers were there, and so was I. Wally shook my hand in the parking lot. "Call me if they appeal. They won't, but call me." He paused. "And Miss Price? That calculator? Nice touch. I didn't plan that. Neither did I. I just didn't want to leave it in the car." He smiled, the first full smile I'd seen from Wallace Taggart, and walked to his truck. A Chevy, 12 years old, clean. The truck of a man who bills $3.50 an hour and spends $40 on himself. I liked Wally. He understood that value and price were different columns. Gerald came out last. I was already in my car, a Honda Accord, 3 years old, purchased outright, but I hadn't started the engine yet. I was adjusting the mirror when I saw him. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps, alone. Bonnie and Amber had gone out a side exit, or maybe they were waiting in their own car, or maybe they'd left without him. Gerald Price stood by himself in the Florida sun in his navy vest, the one with 6 buttons, and I noticed something I'd never seen before. The vest was buttoned wrong. One button off. The bottom hole empty. The top hole doubled. Gerald Price, who had stood behind the counter of his laundromat every morning for 20 years, with his shirt tucked and his collar straight, and his voice ready to fill whatever room he entered. Gerald Price had buttoned his vest wrong, and nobody had fixed it for him. He didn't approach my car, didn't yell across the parking lot, didn't raise his hand or his voice or his chin. He reached into his pocket, pulled out nothing, and put his hand back. A man who always had the answer, standing in a parking lot with empty pockets, and a daughter he'd called a thief, and a judgment that said otherwise. I watched him in the rearview mirror. 3 seconds. Then I turned the key, and the Accord started on the first try. Because I maintained it on schedule, because that's what you do with things that belong to you. That evening, Destin. The deck. Same spot where I'd sat 2 years earlier with a notebook on my knees and a question I couldn't answer. The Gulf was doing what it always did, folding, arriving, leaving, arriving again. Patient. Uninterested in keeping score. I'd brought the calculator home from the courtroom. Took it out of my bag and held it for a while. 18 years. The silver was gone. The 7 was blank. The battery still worked, I'd checked, because of course I'd checked. The display said 0, which is what calculators say when they're waiting for someone to give them a purpose. I set it on the deck railing. Not dramatically, not symbolically. Just set it down the way you set down a tool at the end of a job, with respect, and with the understanding that the job was finished. Doris's words came back. "You were the whole skeleton." She was right. I had been the framework that held up a family that never once asked the framework what it needed. But a skeleton isn't a person. It's the thing that remains when everything living has been consumed. And I was done being consumed. I wanted to be the woman who lived in the house, not the structure that held it up for someone else. My father once told me I was the spine of the family. He meant it as a compliment. It took me 7 years to understand it was a job description. And it took one sealed envelope to show him the invoice. The villa is still mine. The ocean is still here. And somewhere in an Atlanta laundromat that used to be 4 laundromats, A man is standing behind a counter, trying to make the numbers work without the daughter he fired for being right. I hope he figures it out. I really do. But I won't be the one to help him. Not this time. Some accounts are closed. What do you think, family really owes each other everything? Or just the truth? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been the one keeping the books while nobody noticed I see you, you're not alone.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.